Most people think of the Korean War as a clash of tanks, jets, and artillery. An early Cold War proving ground for modern industrial warfare. Steel dominates the imagery: steel helmets, steel hulls, steel shell casings. But one of the quiet realities of that war is that survival on the peninsula often depended less on steel and more on timber. In frozen ridgelines and shattered villages, it was wood, cut, shaped and reinforced under pressure, that sustained defensive lines, preserved manpower, and outlasted metal under extreme conditions. If you value serious historical analysis that looks beneath the surface of familiar conflicts, subscribe to History Matters. This channel focuses on the overlooked mechanics of survival and adaptation that rarely make it into broad summaries. To understand why timber mattered so much in Korea, we need to step away from the battlefield maps and consider terrain and climate first. The Korean Peninsula is mountainous, with narrow valleys and ridgelines that dominate movement. During the winter of 1950 to 51, temperatures routinely fell well below freezing, particularly in northern sectors. Steel equipment malfunctioned in extreme cold. Lubricants thickened. Metal components became brittle. Frostbite and exposure threatened troops as much as enemy fire. In that environment, the ability to construct insulated, reinforced positions quickly became a strategic necessity. Early in the war, many United Nations forces underestimated the need for deeply fortified positions. Movement and maneuver were initially prioritized, especially during the rapid advances following the Incheon landing. But when Chinese forces entered the conflict in late 1950, and the front stabilized into a grinding stalemate along defensive lines, field fortification became central, and that is where timber quietly outperformed iron. Defensive warfare in Korea increasingly relied on bunker systems dug into hillsides. These were not temporary foxholes. They were reinforced structures built to withstand artillery barrages and repeated infantry assaults. Steel beams and prefabricated materials were limited and logistically difficult to transport across rugged terrain. Timber, however, was locally available and adaptable. Engineers and infantry units harvested wood from surrounding areas to create overhead cover, capable of absorbing shrapnel and distributing blast force. Layered logs, often topped with packed earth, formed roofs several feet thick. In many cases, this combination proved more resilient against indirect fire than thin metal sheeting, which could deform catastrophically under impact. Timber's advantage was not strength alone. It was flexibility. When artillery rounds detonated nearby, rigid metal structures transferred shockwaves abruptly. Wood, by contrast, absorbed and dissipated energy gradually. Properly layered logs acted as shock absorbers. Earth packed above them further dampened concussive force. The result was a defensive system that could endure sustained bombardment and be repaired quickly if damaged. This pattern repeated across the front lines, particularly during the later static phase of the war, around the 38th parallel. On ridges such as Heartbreak Ridge and Porkchop Hill, defensive positions became semi-permanent. Units rotated through bunker complexes reinforced continuously with timber. Supply chains could deliver ammunition and rations, but heavy steel supports were scarce in forward areas. Wood became the backbone of survival infrastructure. There's also a climate dimension that is often overlooked. Metal transmits cold rapidly. In sub-zero temperatures, steel structures become freezing surfaces that draw heat from the human body. Timber insulates. Bunkers lined with wood retained warmth more effectively, especially when combined with small heating stoves. In winter conditions, this difference affected not only comfort, but combat effectiveness. Troops sheltered in insulated positions maintained higher readiness and suffered fewer cold weather injuries. The war reinforced lessons that many militaries had learned imperfectly during the Second World War. Climate can neutralize technological superiority if adaptation lags. In Korea, Armies equipped with advanced weapons systems still depended on manual labor and local materials to hold ground. Timber fortifications required constant maintenance. Logs decayed, shifted, or were destroyed by artillery. Units developed routines of reinforcement, deepening trenches and thickening overhead cover in response to observed enemy fire patterns. These practices influenced later military doctrine in subtle ways. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, for example, refined cold-weather fortification manuals after Korea, incorporating lessons about layered overhead protection and field-expedient materials. The principle was clear: resilience does not require industrial perfection. It requires intelligent use of available resources. Chinese and North Korean forces applied similar logic, often digging extensive tunnel networks reinforced with timber supports. These underground systems allowed movement between positions with reduced exposure to air attack and artillery. Again, steel was limited. Timber and earth were abundant. The result was a war increasingly fought beneath the surface. Air power, one of the defining features of the Korean War, further underscored timber's utility. Bombing campaigns targeted infrastructure relentlessly. Bridges, railways, and supply depots, many constructed with steel, were destroyed repeatedly. Yet field fortifications built from wood and earth were harder to eliminate permanently. They could be rebuilt quickly with local labor. The very simplicity of timber-based structures made them strategically durable. This is not to romanticize hardship. Conditions inside these bunkers were often cramped and austere. Ventilation was imperfect. Rot and insects posed ongoing challenges. But from a purely functional perspective, timber outlasted iron in the specific environment of Korean trench warfare. There is a broader pattern here that, extends beyond Korea. Throughout military history, armies that adapt to terrain and climate endure longer than those that rely solely on technological advantage. In Korea, steel tanks and aircraft shaped the operational picture, but at the tactical level, on windswept hills where infantry held ground, wood and earth really defined survival. For survival-minded viewers, this underscores an enduring principle. Durability often comes from layered systems rather than singular strength. A log and earth bunker distributes force and insulates simultaneously. A thin steel barrier may appear stronger, but fails differently under stress. The Korean War also illustrates the limits of supply chains in rugged environments. Transporting steel beams into mountainous forward positions required vehicles vulnerable to ambush and weather. Timber could be cut and shaped on site. In prolonged conflict, local sourcing reduces dependency and increases autonomy. These are logistical lessons with implications far beyond mid-20th century warfare. Even after the armistice in 1953, the demilitarized zone remained heavily fortified. Many early defensive works incorporated lessons from the war's static phase, blending reinforced concrete with timber and earth where appropriate. Hybrid systems proved more adaptable than purely metallic structures. What makes this story worth remembering is not the material itself, but what it reveals about human adaptation under pressure. The Korean War is often framed as a precursor to modern high-tech conflict. Yet on the ground, survival depended on skills as old as settlement, cutting timber, shaping supports, layering earth. Industrial warfare did not eliminate traditional methods. It forced their refinement. When we look at conflicts only through the lens of weapon systems and grand strategy, we miss these quieter continuities. The men who held those ridgelines endured not because steel shielded them completely, but because they built intelligently with what they had. Understanding that matters, history is not only about decisive offensives or diplomatic stalemates, it is about the cumulative decisions made in harsh environments, decisions about shelter, insulation, reinforcement, and repair. Timber in Korea outlasted iron not because it was inherently superior, but because it matched the environment more effectively. For those who study warfare seriously, this should, temper assumptions about technological inevitability. Materials succeed or fail in context. Climate, terrain, and logistics determine longevity as much as engineering specifications. Remembering these details deepens our understanding of the Korean War beyond its headlines. It reveals a conflict shaped as much by mountains and winter as by ideology and geopolitics. If you value this kind of in-depth, grounded historical analysis, subscribe to History Maters and share this video with others who appreciate careful study of overlooked realities. The lessons embedded in these stories are not relics, they are reminders that endurance often rests on practical adaptation rather than spectacle.